Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest Dispatch from the Front. From time to time, we go a little bit deeper on certain cultural values, talk about them a little bit more, explain them a little bit more, so that as you go about and analyze a company's culture, you're well armed with something that you may want to be looking for. One of these values I want to talk with you about today, and that is a value which I have not seen on any company's list of values, but one which certainly in my career I have highly prized, I have tried to inculcate in my teams, and which I think you should consider looking for and lobbying for. And that value is transparency. What do I mean by transparency? What I mean is that we do not pursue hidden agendas. We are open and transparent with each other. I'm a Catholic. I'm a traditional Catholic. And one of the ways that we get this point of transparency across within those circles is to quote scripture and say, let your yes be yes and your no be no. It's that simple. No hidden agenda, transparency. If you support something, support it. Support it wholeheartedly. Commit to it. If you don't support something, oppose it. Oppose it wholeheartedly. Commit to it. Does that mean that there may be penalties for adopting such a position? Well, there usually are. But as kind of a subset of integrity, if you will, transparency has the great virtue of making clear what your position is. It helps you to avoid the stench of hypocrisy, as well as the potential compromise of your integrity. Because you get into situations where you said you supported something, you don't really, and you get caught either slow rolling it or undermining it, and then you got some splaining to do. And that can lead you further down the road of lying about things to try and extricate yourself from the mess you've made. Better to avoid all of that by simply being transparent. So from a personal integrity standpoint, transparency is very important. When you're running teams, when you're dealing with people, when you're having discussions about their career and their growth, I find it really pays to be transparent about it. There are only so many opportunities available at any one moment within any one organization. So generally, if you want to put yourself in a position to be able to take that opportunity and grow, it requires some coordination ahead of time. So when I have development discussions with my people, I like to do it from the basis of pure transparency, encouraging them to tell me what it is that they're looking for by first committing that whatever it is they are looking for, I will do my best to help them get there. If it means that they would like to take my job someday, then I will do my best to help them understand my job and place themselves in a position where when I move on to whatever I'm moving on to, they can step in. Good for me, good for them. That transparency also applies to hard conversations. So if someone's not working out, I like to just have an open conversation about it And I'm very transparent about, hey, if things don't work out, if they don't turn around, I will support you in finding something else. That's one possible outcome of continued subpar performance. You know, those aren't the most pleasant conversations, but if we're transparent, if we're open, if we're not working hidden agendas, they can be very productive conversations. In my career, unfortunately, transparency has not always been in evidence. And so you run into situations where trust gets blown up because somebody's working a different agenda. I worked at a company where from day one, because I was perceived as a threat to somebody, they set about undermining me with my own team, with my boss, just across the board. This led to a conversation with my boss at one point where I told my boss outright, you will never hear me badmouth a colleague regardless of the situation. And he tried to bait me into doing that, but I wouldn't do it. I considered it to be unprofessional and to be a sign of poor character and poor integrity to boot. Now, when one side is playing the gossip game and the other side isn't, unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily work out to the side that's above board's benefit. We were considering a reorg of the team. There was a person on the team, on another team, who I worked very well with. It made all the sense in the world to have this person on my team, given the way things were going. But there was a holdup. My boss told me that the holdup was that this person claimed they didn't want to work with me. That was very surprising because we seem to get along well and work well together. And so, shortly after that discussion, I pulled this person aside and had a short conversation where I just said, look, I'm hearing that you might have an issue with me. I'm very surprised to hear that. I want us to work well together, and I will do anything in my power so that we will work well together. If you feel comfortable and could let me know how I can better do that, I would really appreciate it. And so this person looked at me and said, I don't have a problem working with you. They said, my manager approached me about a potential change, and the only thing I said was, I like the way things are going at the moment, so my preference would be, if possible, that we continue as we are at the moment. That was all I said. Obviously, that wasn't how it was spun, because that manager's manager decided to play a hidden agenda. Well, the manager and their manager, when they realized that I'd met with this person and had an open and transparent conversation with them, lost their full minds. My boss was embarrassed by that turn of events and started to lambaste me for having that conversation. Whereupon I said, look, if somebody is going to say something and have an issue, then the professional way out of it is to actually have an open and transparent discussion about it. This was a non-threatening conversation. There was no tension whatsoever in the conversation. If you don't believe me, you can ask them. But the fact that you have two managers who lied to you about this is something you need to deal with. And that's all I'll say about it. So, needless to say, not every manager, not even every executive, has the intestinal fortitude to maintain transparency as value. They like to play games. They like to play little political games where they pit colleagues against each other. They like the drama of the corporate ladder and the attempts that some engage in to try and pull people off their rung of the ladder so that they can advance one rung on it. As a matter of fact, the manager's manager in this circumstance had a little Australian slang applied to them. They were known as the toe cutter, because anyone that was perceived as climbing the ladder, they would try and cut their toes off so that they couldn't advance that rung. They couldn't move up and make them feel bad. The headquarters environment that we all worked in was referred to in the field as the snake pit, with plenty of justification, as that anecdote should reveal. But fast forward several months to where we had an important project coming up, and I made it clear at the outset of the project that transparency was going to be one of the core virtues of the project. And I struck it home by looking that manager in the eye in front of everyone and saying, there will be no gatekeepers of information. Information will be shared with everyone on the team. Because that was one of this person's favorite tricks, was to compartmentalize information, not let it out. Keep it for themselves so that they could maintain their relevance and only play that information card at the time when it was of maximum benefit to them. This was a person who was stuck in the 1980s. They may as well have been wearing parachute pants and leg warmers to work, because they didn't understand another core aspect of transparency, which is that information wants to be free. It used to be, back in the day, that information was expensive and hard to come by, and therefore was a potential source of power to those who had it. There were haves and have-nots in the information space. And so they developed habits of procuring this information and then guarding it most diligently, lest anyone else find out about it and be able to put it to good use. Nowadays, it's totally different. We are absolutely drowning in information. And it takes real talent to understand what information is valuable and what's not. And to be able to translate that information that you get from the raw form you tend to get it in into something that's actually useful for making better decisions. So when we set out to work on that project, we had a ton of information that was going to be analyzed and recast to help us make good decisions for the company. And it simply wouldn't do to have someone trying to play information broker on that team. And we took big steps to ensure that that was not possible. When you talk about inclusivity, true inclusivity involved making sure that all players across the company who had any sort of stake whatsoever in the outcome of that effort were part of it. And they had representatives on the team, and those representatives were fully briefed on what we were finding. It required us to have fairly frequent touch points, going over the data and what it meant, absorbing it, discussing it, and coming to a consensus on what it was telling us and what we ought to do about it. But at the end of the day, despite the fact that the core team on this effort was about 9-10 people, the extended team on this effort had access to all the information, and the only difference between core and extended was how frequently we met. We had about 45 people on the team, so it was a large effort. And when it came time to share the fruits of that effort, everyone that was involved in the effort was on board with it. Where we ran into trouble was when a couple of executives elected to act in a non-transparent fashion and undermined the effort at the 11th hour. So again, it can be difficult to maintain values such as transparency when they run kind of against the grain of the broader company culture. That was not a value of this company's culture. We were a subculture within it. And these executives simply decided not to play ball, which you should have seen coming, because that was kind of how they operated in general. But what can you do about it? We put the best possible option on the table, did great work in getting it there, and built a pretty sizable groundswell for it, such that years later, they're able to take another bite of that apple if they so desire. There's enough of the original cadre of folks there who fondly remember that effort to help reignite those flames at an appropriate point where the overall company culture will allow for it. So again, a disappointing final outcome, but still that value of transparency served us well throughout the effort. I had a similar one years earlier working in banking, where we were coming up with a brand new capability, and my colleague from the IT perspective, who was actually doing the coding on this thing, was a very passionate advocate for transparency. Believed in his heart and soul that the whole point of what we were trying to do was to democratize information, to take it out of the small niches it had inhabited until that point, and put it in the hands of decision makers on the front lines. And if that wasn't what we were trying to do, well, what was the point? So we built into the development cycle for that particular project a very transparent mechanism of capturing our stakeholders' preferences with regard to how they were going to use this application in order to make decisions. And we referred to it as the optometrist test. You know, just about any aspect of it you could think of, from the GUI, the graphs that were being produced, the reports that were being produced, the way the drill down's working, the information, etc., was presented to them in a form of a stark contrast we called A and B. And we did that to elucidate the design principles that were going to be built into the final app. So it wasn't so much to settle on, we're going to do exactly this way. We did some of that later in the game. But it was basically to say, does this overall principle work? Should we prize this principle over this other principle? And so we went through a large number of these, A versus B. What do you like better? What do you like better? What do you like better? Later on in testing, we leveraged something that we called speed to insight. It was basically looking at something, how fast could you get the answer? And if we did our job well, the answer would be, well, very fast. I can tell what the answer is within seconds. and I can be on to the next business question seconds thereafter. That made for a truly immersive experience. And so we believed wholeheartedly that it was the customer, the stakeholder, who determined what was good, not us. We just put up options. And when we saw what the options were, we would adopt whatever worked best for the person using it. Well, late in the game, we had other members of the team added. We had a new manager who came in over the effort, and they didn't buy in any of this. They didn't believe in the transparency. They didn't believe in the fact that the customer, the user, their opinion counted more than anybody's. Didn't believe that. And so they started putting in arbitrary requirements. One of the first was that this particular manager had pulled together a PowerPoint presentation, never talked to any of us, and they wanted to make that PowerPoint presentation, one slide of it, the heart of the GUI of this system. Well, we didn't like that. Not least of which because some of the acronyms they wanted to use reused the same letters and weren't kind of standard banking acronyms, so nobody knew what the hell it meant. So trying to navigate using that kind of a device was a recipe in just foolishness. But what it led to was me leaving that role, moving over to another business to get away from this person because I felt I had pushed the ball as far as I could and I wasn't going to want to work for this person. My partner in crime on the effort there left the company. Went all the way out to LA to escape this nonsense. And the interesting thing was the application went on without us to be able to develop it. They had to kind of leave it alone, and it continued to be found useful. So at least 5 years after we had left, the app was still up and running, and people were still using it. Kind of a testament to how well designed it really was. I tell you that because it's just another example of how when we're transparent, good things happen. And when we're not, when we're pursuing agendas that don't align with that, not much good can happen. Transparency is an important value to have in any collaborative, creative effort. Transparency is also an important bulwark of trust. So whether you're talking about the trust that needs to exist between a leader and their team, between teams working on the same larger team, between colleagues within a team, between a company and its customers and its suppliers, transparency is important. Whenever we've had contentious contract negotiations, you scratch the surface a little bit, and the reason that they're tough is often a lack of transparency. People are not coming clean about what it is that they want and need, and therefore you get a lot of churn. When teams first form, and you're going through the stages of team formation, right? The forming, norming, storming, performing stages. Often it starts out cloudy because you're not sure what everybody's agenda is on that team, and it takes time for everyone to kind of pull in the same direction and to start to trust one another. But if we start with a value of transparency, then that greatly accelerates. Transparency even extends, in my view, to situations such as layoffs. I have always tried to give my people as much runway when a layoff is coming as humanly possible. It takes time to find another job. Losing your job is a very traumatic thing. And so, putting myself in their shoes, I try, and as soon as I know that something might be in the offing, I let them know to begin preparing. There's a risk that's associated with that. They could go running down the hallway to HR and it could blow up in my face. It never has, because people are generally grateful to know. But it could. Maybe one day it will. But still, the right thing to do in my mind is that as soon as a person's job is likely to be impacted, is to enable them to start planning for their next job so that they can bridge that gap and support their families. That to me is an aspect of transparency as well. When people have left me to go to work for other companies, I have offered them the same thing, which is, look, if you need a recommendation, if you need me to reach out to somebody, I'm more than happy to do it on your behalf. That soft landing, I view as an aspect of transparency. If you've made the decision for yourself and your family that you need to make a change, then I'm not going to hold that against you. I'm going to help you just as much as I would in your career if you were continuing with our company. And for that reason, I still have in my LinkedIn connections quite a few people who worked for me in the past. A number of them have been a big help to me in my career years later, in part because of that commitment. So in wrapping up, I would highly encourage you to consider transparency as one of those must-have values that you look for when you look for a company, you look for a role, you look for a job, and that you inculcate that within your own teams. You commit to it. Good things happen when leaders are open and honest. Bad things start to happen when we're not. And if you see a company where power is exchanged in the form of secrets and information, you might want to think twice about whether that's the company for you. Let your yes be yes. Let your no be no. Be open, be honest, and be successful. Thank you, and have a great day.